Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I want to welcome you all to our weekly CIIFAD seminar. I'm very delighted to have a distinguished colleagues with us today to present. Before we get into the formal presentation, let me just make just a couple of announcements. On April 19th, CIIFAD is holding its annual symposium. That day, the seminar will move to room 401. This year, the symposium is in conjunction and in partnership with the Institute of African Development, and Dr. Kite, and Duge, raise your hand, has been very instrumental in designing a very wonderful 3-day program involving IT technology, communication technology, cell phone use, mobile money, around its transformative powers of economic development. So we want to invite you all to that setting. We'll make continued announcements on that, but that day the seminar will be in 401 because the rest of the afternoon activities will start from there, not room 135. We do have a seminar here next week, and then we have spring break, and then we have another seminar here, and then we're going to go over to 401 on April the 19th. I should also say that the person who has been organizing this seminar series since its inception is transitioning over to the Department of Development and Sociology. As we all know, Jenny, raise your hands in the corner over there. So let's give Jenny a wonderful hand for all the wonderful work that she's done for so many years on this program. She's going to be very, very dearly missed by all of us, but she won't be far. She's going to be in development So the joke in the office is that for about 7 or 8 years I've been trying to fire Jenny. But every time I get out the word she said I quit just before I could get it out, and so this time she's followed through on her threat. And so, she's going to be near. So for the next few weeks, Jenny will be coming back just on Wednesdays. Just for the seminar until the end of the semester, which is very kind of her. So if you don't give a chance to thank her today, you can thank her over the next 3 to 4 weeks and continue to thank her. She really deserves it. It is my real pleasure to present our speaker today, but it's important that we put this conversation in context. You know, Cornell is one of the few places, universities in the world, that could have and sustain a long-term relationship in a development process. Most places live and die by short-term projects, 3-year projects, 5-year projects, sometimes 10-year projects. And development is oftentimes a long-term proposition. Development is a process, and poverty is a condition. And this development process is something that you don't solve in 3-year projects or 5-year projects. One of the most visible programs, and I won't call it a project, it's a program, it's an institute, it's embedded in our DNA here at Cornell, is our work with Tata, the Tata-Cornell Initiative, which integrates agriculture, nutrition, and applied economics. I understand that even animal scientists are involved in this thing. And so I am just so very pleased that our speaker today is coming forth and bring us an update on this important work. I've known Prabhu. Prabhu, let's not count the years. It's been a long time. Since we were little kids. And it is true, occasionally somebody walks up to me and say, oh, and they think that I'm Prabhu, and I said, no, I'm not Prabhu. But that does happen occasionally. I forgot to tell you that, Prabhu. But Prabhu and I met a long time ago, and over the years we maintained contact. And he was with the CGIR system in Mexico, was the head economist there, and I do remember having a fantastic lunch with him in Rome when he was at FAO Rome, and then there he moved to the Gates Foundation. I think his name is synonymous with modern day agricultural development. And I'm very pleased to introduce our colleague, Professor Pingali. Prabhu?
Thank you, Ralph. Thanks for the great introduction. It's always a delight to speak at the CIIFAD seminars. Some of you have heard me in the past. You've heard me talk about the Tata-Cornell Initiative. We now call it Tata-Cornell Institute. Over the last 4 years that I've been at Cornell, we've seen tremendous progress in that, building up this institute and looking at this chronic problem of malnutrition in India. Malnutrition that continues to persist even as economic growth is taking place. Trying to understand why this problem persists and what are the pathways to addressing this problem. Particularly, what's the role of agriculture, the role of food systems in addressing the problem of malnutrition in India. Today, the Tata-Cornell Institute has 15 PhD students enrolled with us. We've got students from across the campus, applied economists, nutritionists, development sociologists, animal scientists, soil scientists, plant scientists, etc. We also have 4 postdoctoral fellows in the program. So it's a program that I'm honored to be directing, and a program that I'm particularly proud of as something that I've done in my career. But last year, about a little bit over a year ago, TCI had to get on steroids in a way, because we suddenly found ourselves at the receiving end of a major grant from the Gates Foundation. We were competitively selected for a grant to look at how do we scale up our activities and our knowledge in order to create a more nutritious food system in India. So we were given a grant which is called TARINA. TARINA stands for Technical Assistance and Research in Indian Nutrition and Agriculture. So what I want to do today is talk to you about TARINA, about the work that we've been doing over the last year and the work that we're going to do over the next 4 years with this technical assistance grant. And I'll end up telling you why I think an institution like Cornell is a natural player in providing such technical assistance and action-oriented research in the developing world, something Ralph already alluded to. So I'll come back to that at the end of my talk. But first, let's look at what's happening in India today in terms of food systems. If you look at India, there's all kinds of stories around India. But one of the stories that is told very often is this dramatic drop in poverty that's happening in the country. And this drop in poverty has been taking place across decades, since about the 60s, early 70s onwards. We can quibble about the numbers, we can quibble about the rate of drop, we can talk about the absolute number of poor still being very high, but no one can dispute the fact that there's been a steady drop in the proportion of poor in the country. So the converse of that is the income rise that you see is quite steady. GDP growth of about 7% per annum over the last 2 decades. You see the rise in middle class populations. You see rises in overall welfare taking place among the higher income groups, the middle class groups, etc. And with that, you're beginning to see dramatic changes in diets taking place. Diets which were predominantly staple grain diets becoming more and more diversified diets. Diets that include vegetables and fruit and milk, dairy products, meat products, etc. And yes, processed food. There's a big dramatic change taking place. Part of that change is driven by income. Part of that change is driven by urbanization. Part of that change is driven by globalization. But it's very palpable, this change that's happening. And that's something we should keep in mind as we go through this talk today. And one way you see that is you see per capita consumption of staple grains dropping across the income distribution spectrum, except for the lowest income bracket. In all other income brackets across the country, whether you're talking about rural population or whether you're talking about urban population, there's been a distinct drop in per capita consumption of staple grain calories. Now, this doesn't mean that food consumption has dropped. This only means that people are moving from calories that come from staple grains to other sources of calorie and other sources of food. And that's, I think, the fundamental part of why we need to look at a food system that goes beyond staple grains. And that's where I think much of the story comes in. Now, even if I'm optimistic about India and the potential for overall welfare improvements in India, I'm not undervaluing the importance of some of the chronic problems India continues to face. And the one major chronic problem India continues to face is severe malnutrition. The incidence of malnutrition continues to be very high, but it's also important to realize that it's becoming increasingly concentrated in a few states. It's becoming increasingly concentrated right in this eastern India, central India belt. The more progressive states of India are beginning to see significant drops in overall malnutrition levels. But that concentration is high. The number of people that are malnourished in absolute terms is very, very high. And it continues to be a significant problem for us to be concerned about. And that's what our program is concerned about quite a lot. But here's something interesting that's happening. And one of our summer interns, Karina Acosta, sitting at the back here, put this slide together for us. What this slide shows us is that over time, you're beginning to see a dual burden of malnutrition happening in India. You're beginning to see both undernourishment and undernourishment-related malnutrition problems, as well as overnourishment, overweight, obesity. Both of these problems coming together. And what's interesting from this graph is the states that are more progressive, states with higher income levels, are also states where you see higher levels of overnourishment and obesity trends happening. And what's most interesting is that you're beginning to see this problem in the same household. You're beginning to see undernourishment and overnourishment happening in the same household. Quite often, it's the younger girls, it's the children that tend to be undernourished, and the older adult population becoming overnourished. This is a really new problem that food policy analysts in India are facing. And I believe most of them haven't even started to grapple with how do you address this problem of dual malnourishment taking place. Now, in my view, and this is something that I've written quite a bit about, the solution to undernourishment and the solution to overnourishment is the same. The solution is to get to a food system that's more nutritious, a food system that has much higher proportions of vegetables, horticulture products, livestock products, etc., and to make that more affordable to the poor. That way you substitute away from moving into processed foods into having more nutritious diet that's available and affordable. So that's where much of our work is focused on. It's trying to get to that sweet spot of how do you get a food system to diversify and to become more affordable in a nutrition sense. Now, we see this demand rising, but what's happening on the supply side? Has the supply of food also kept up with the trends that are taking place in the demand? And unfortunately, the answer is no. Here's some really interesting graphs that you can find on our website. This graph shows you the proportion of area that was under cereal crops, rice and wheat and maize, in the 1960s. And you find that there was low yield, low productivity cereal crop production taking place across the whole country. But you also saw most of these areas not only produced rice and wheat, but they also grew millets and pulses and several other crops. What happened with the Green Revolution was the Green Revolution basically brought rice and wheat cultivation up into what's known as the Indo-Gangetic Plain, going from Punjab all the way down to Bangladesh, and across on the seaboard sides on the east coast and the west coast also. And the middle of the country sort of got out of staple grain production, got out of intensive production systems, and the intensive production systems got concentrated in the more favorable areas. Now, as that happened, the more nutritious millets, the more nutritious pulse crops, etc., got pushed out of these more productive zones. And over time, you began to see a loss in overall area under these more nutritious crops. So over time, you found that the area under pulses dropped. So today, the area under pulses in India is about 650,000 hectares less than it was in the 1960s, whereas the demand for pulses has quadrupled in that same time period. The overall productivity of pulses hasn't kept up. Now, why is pulses important? Pulses are important because that's the main source of protein for a vegetarian population. And if you don't have that source of protein, you run into severe malnutrition problems, along with access to micronutrient supply, etc. You do see some improvements in the fruits and vegetables side, but the area under fruits and vegetables hasn't grown enough to keep up with the rising demand that's taking place for fruits and vegetables. So as a result, over time, when you look at prices, you look at prices of more nutritious food, protein-rich food, micronutrient-rich food, etc. These prices have been rising. These prices have gone up 2.5 to 3 times just in the last decade, okay? Whereas the price of staple grains has remained relatively stable. So what's the consequence? The consequence is you tend to expand on the cheaper food that you have relative to diversifying your diet adequately in order to get a more nutritious diet. So even though diversification of diets is taking place, it's not taking place to the extent that you need in order to improve overall nutrition and dramatically reduce this malnutrition problem that we have in India. So why is the supply response so low? Why is it that even with prices rising, farmers are not willing to switch from just producing staples to diversifying their production systems? I think one of the primary reasons for it is the success that the Green Revolution had in India in rapidly expanding rice and wheat productivity, and rice and wheat production and supply also became a major barrier in terms of moving these agriculture systems out of staple grains. Because of the policy environment, because of the institutional environment, because of the infrastructure systems that are in place that basically promote rice and wheat cultivation and discourage the movement out of these staples, you create the system which kind of just pumps out more and more of staples and resists the movement out of staples. In addition to that, the infrastructure, the market systems, the infrastructure systems, the skill requirements, etc., to move from a staple grain production system to a non-staple production system are very high. The transactions costs for small farmers integrating into the market, the value chain, etc., are very high. And therefore, there's been this reluctance to move out and to diversify production systems. And food policy groups in India haven't been successful in addressing this problem. Food policy community in India is still stuck on, do we have enough rice and wheat, rather than saying, do we have adequate amounts of all the different food groups that are needed for a balanced diet. And unless you make that transition, you're not going to see big changes taking place in all of these factors. So where do we come in? Well, as an institution, we've been trying to promote the idea that you need to get out of staple grains, you need to get into a more diversified production system, you need to have a more diversified diet, etc. And many of the ways we think about that is to think about policy change, policy reform, think about technologies, productivity growth opportunities for non-staples, think about some of the institutional changes, the behavior changes, etc. These are some of the things that the Tata-Cornell Institute has been working on over the past 4 years. But over the last year, as I said, we suddenly started to scale up our operations. And we scaled up our operations primarily because of this Gates Foundation grant that we received. We received a $13 million grant that goes over a 4-year time period. And the primary goal here is to tackle malnutrition in India by promoting a more diversified food system that enhances the availability, affordability of nutrient-rich food for the poor, for the rural poor. So that's the goal that we set out to achieve and to work towards. Now, we're not doing this alone. We're doing this with several high-quality partners. We're working along with Cornell University, with Emory University, and the Tata Institute of Social Sciences as premier academic institutions. The International Food Policy Research Institute as a major food policy think tank based in Washington, D.C., and then very strong NGO groups in India that are working with us on the ground. BIFE, the second largest NGO in India, CARE, which is a global NGO with strong operations in India, and Grameen Development Services, another smaller NGO based in India. So we've been working in this consortium of on-the-ground development practitioners, as well as academics and think tank specialists, all coming together to try and see how we can move forward towards a pathway of improved food systems. The framework that we used is a framework where we have a goal of creating a more nutrition-sensitive food system that improves availability and affordability and improved quality. And we try to achieve this using 3 objectives. The first objective is essentially to go down to agriculture projects that are being done today. Many of the big agriculture projects that are funded by places like the World Bank, by national government, the state government, etc., are all agriculture projects that are focused on the staple grains. What we are trying to do is go into these projects and try to get them to enhance the production systems within those project areas, to bring in new crops, to bring in pulses, to bring in vegetables, horticulture projects, products, etc. And even new crops such as orange flesh sweet potato, vitamin A rich sweet potato, bringing them into the system, bringing behavior change into the system in these project areas so people start to demand a higher quality diet and a more diversified diet. So that's one major activity that we have on the ground in very remote locations across the country. The second is to look at the policies that are in place today, the food policies, food security policies, the agriculture policies in the country, and trying to modernize the paradigms around which these policies are created. The past paradigm was, do we have enough calories in order to meet hunger? The paradigm today is, do we have adequate quantities of a balanced food system? Adequate quantities that allow us to have a diet that's balanced in nutrients, that can improve our overall health and overall well-being. So that's a paradigm shift. And that requires big policy changes. And one of the areas we particularly focused on is creating that policy awareness and policy reform that has to take place. The third area is actually capacity building. Capacity building within the country so that this kind of work continues beyond the project and you have a cadre of people that can work on this, in this area. So let me go briefly through some of the work that we are doing. So we're now located in 3 states in India and 4 districts. And many of them are quite remote areas within the country. And what we're trying to do is create district level strategies for seeing change happen, for scaling up interventions at a district level. And what are some of the interventions? The interventions are around improving overall demand for diet change, improving overall diversification of diets, looking at bringing women into the development process, empowering women's groups to be able to be the conduits of change that needs to take place, looking at some of the seasonal food deficits and how do we address those food deficits, and finally looking at ways in which we can track some of the changes that are taking place, create metrics for measuring progress, etc. Here's some, let me go through very quickly and show you snapshots of some of the work that's going on. In Uttar Pradesh, which is a state up in the northern part of the country, it just went through an election, by the way, we're trying to introduce orange flesh sweet potatoes. Orange flesh sweet potato is not a regular part of the diet in India. It's not a staple. It's an occasional, sweet potato is an occasional vegetable, sometimes a snack. What we're trying to do is bring orange flesh sweet potato that's rich in vitamin A and try to promote it as part of the home gardens within these communities, and try to see how one can enhance access to vitamin A by bringing it into the food system in this area. Some of you may recognize this lady here. It's Vanya Gupta. She did her IARD MP? No, sorry, Vanya Mehta, not Gupta. She MPS in IARD last year. And she now works with us in our office in Delhi. And she's been very much involved in this Uttar Pradesh project. The second thing we're doing is we're going into areas in UP, in Bihar, and these areas look like this, where you grow a crop of rice, followed by a crop of wheat, and then you leave your land fallow till the next season starts. What we're trying to do in those areas is go into that fallow period right after the wheat crop and grow a pulse crop. We've been introducing a pulse crop into the system. And by introducing the pulse crop into the system, you're actually providing an opportunity for enhancing local supply of protein-rich food that comes in. And that's this is the first cycle of that new crop that's been brought into the system. And we're now tracking some of the change that's happening. In Orissa, we have a much more difficult problem. The difficult problem in Orissa is you only have one crop because there's no irrigation infrastructure. And so after the rice crop, the land is left fallow for the next 8 months. So what we're trying to do is create local water systems, create ways in which you can grow a crop on residual moisture after the rice crop, use conservation tillage systems, etc., and bring in a new crop of pulses. that comes in right after the rice crop is harvested, and thereby enhance some of the pulse requirements that's happening. We're also doing quite a lot of work on livestock systems, promoting small-scale livestock systems in these areas where primarily much of that agriculture is focused on crops. And one of the areas that we've been particularly focused on is to look at artificial insemination, which is quite common in cattle, but not very common in small ruminants such as goats. And we're trying to create mechanisms by which we can look at the technology behind bringing artificial insemination into goats and promoting that to promote goat production systems in the country. We're doing a lot of work on empowering women's self-help groups. What we're doing with women's self-help groups is to look at how do you get women's groups to be part of the development process of behavior change that has to take place in terms of new foods and diet diversification, but also in being able to bring in new technologies that women's groups can use in order to reduce drudgery of women in agriculture and release some of the time women have that they spend today in very rigorous agricultural operations so that they can use it for other activities, for home production activities, etc., child rearing activities, and improved nutrition activities. We're looking at some of the ways in which you can reduce the hungry period that happens in the dry season, etc. And the way you address the hungry period is to try and promote home gardens. And today we've got home garden systems going on across 45 villages across these 3 states. And we've gone through the first cycle of home gardens, and we'll continue pushing home garden systems and bringing in more nutritious food into these home gardens. So, where does Cornell fit into all this? These are all activities that we can be doing with different NGO communities, etc. So why should Cornell get into this? Well, one of the reasons Cornell gets into this is because we've got a lot of very smart students who really want to be out there and make a difference. And they want to bring their knowledge and their science to make a difference to real world problems. So I'll show you ways in which some of our students are involved in these projects. Whoops. So this is Katie Merkel. Katie Merkel is in Uttar Pradesh today. And what she's doing is she's working on behavior change communication models which allow us to promote the use of orange flesh sweet potatoes in smallholder systems, in home gardens, etc. And Katie is using this work for her PhD thesis in nutrition. And what she's doing is she's tracking the consumption of the orange flesh sweet potato. She's putting in place metrics that look at changes in vitamin A concentration in their bodies, etc., and some of the changes that take place in vitamin A as the consumption of orange flesh sweet potato takes place. This is Payal Seth. Payal is a PhD student in applied economics. Now, Payal has been particularly excited by a problem that's very common in India. The problem is open defecation. Open defecation is widespread across the country in rural areas. And the government has spent a lot of time in the last decade building latrines everywhere. But very few people are using these latrines. And what Payal wanted to do was to say, why is that the case? And so she's now looking at behavior change in association with latrine construction, to look at ways in which you can effectively get people to change the way they think about open defecation, to shame them into getting out of that practice. And this is something that she's working on in a randomized control trial experiment across 15 villages in UP for her PhD thesis Matthew Abraham, sitting here somewhere, right there, postdoctoral fellow, trying to answer the question, why is it with the demand of pulses going so high, you don't see a supply response? And is the problem related to a lack of a value chain in pulses that links smallholders, pulse producers to the market? What are the transactions costs associated with getting farmers to be more connected into these market systems and into the value chain? Maureen Valentine just spent a year in Orissa, and she worked on doing a PhD. She's doing a PhD in animal science, and worked on goat feeding systems, trying to get goats which go out. Maureen can tell this better than I can. Go out and open graze and destroy the grazing lands, destroy forest lands, etc., and try to create a more intensive grazing system that provides for more sustainable environmental management, common land management, while at the same time improving the nutritive value of the fodder that's produced. So Maureen's come back after a year in the field, and she's writing up her thesis now, and I'm sure she'll be happy to talk to you about the work that she's been doing. Vidya Rajkumar, sitting at the back here, she's off to India soon, and she's going to look at labor-saving technologies for women. Labor-saving technologies for women to address some of the biggest drudgery-filled operations that they face on a daily basis. Transplanting, weeding, harvesting, threshing, etc. And how do you get new technologies to these women? And then what happens to women's time as they move out of those labor-intensive operations and mechanize these operations? Something that's a crucial problem that we need to address in India. Anthony Wendt, I don't know if Anthony's here. Anthony has been doing some incredible work. Anthony is a PhD student in plant sciences. Anthony's been doing some incredible work looking at the mycotoxin risk in India. Aflatoxin is a major problem, and other mycotoxins are a problem. So he spent last summer sampling across several districts in India, sampling all the foods in the stocks in households for aflatoxin and other mycotoxin problems. And one of the most incredible things Anthony found is that normally when you think about mycotoxins, you think about groundnut, you think about maize, but he found mycotoxins to be a real issue in pulses and in rice. Now, if you have mycotoxin as a problem in rice and in wheat, then that's an enormously bigger issue than thinking about mycotoxins as just a problem of peanuts. And so now Anthony is looking at ways in which you can address this problem, ways in which you can try and mitigate some of the problem that's taking place. So those are some of the work that our students are doing. Really exciting work, and it's something that I'm particularly proud of as creating a platform so that we have the best of Cornell talent go out and address some of the problems, real life problems we see in rural India. So we're also doing quite a lot of work in this project on capacity building and on policy advocacy work. We've been doing a series of policy seminars across the country, looking at some of the issues that we need to do in terms of changing the paradigm of thinking around food policy. We've been doing policy seminars around diversification of diets, around diversification of food systems, around looking at the subsidized food grain policy in India and trying to get the subsidized food grain policy to be more open to a more balanced diet. And here's one view of a policy seminar where we took a gender lens and look at the role of women in agriculture systems and what's the role of bringing in new technologies, etc., for these women, and then looking at how that impacts their welfare and nutrition. Here's our office in Delhi. We managed to put, in the last year, start a new office in Delhi, which now has a staff of 5 people. And that's where our Center of Excellence is established today. And this office is now the home from which all of our operations take place in India. It's also the go-to place now for people who need information on what's the new thinking around agriculture and nutrition, what are some of the new methodologies, models, some of the metrics that need to be used. And eventually, we hope also the place where you can get some of the most current data on agriculture and nutrition issues. And if you go to our website, you'll see some of the publications that are coming out, some of the policy briefs, some of the manuals, on the how-to manuals that are being produced, that are coming out of our Center of Excellence in Delhi. Now, one thing that I learned the hard way, I think, over the years, is that a lot of people do a lot of good work. A lot of NGOs do a lot of good work, but they never bother to actually document it. And because they don't document it, no one knows. It's like a tree falling in a forest, and there's no one there to listen. Did it make a sound? That's what happens with a lot of development work. So one thing that we are doing in this project is to put in place M&E systems right from the start. And we're putting in place baseline system, data collection. And right now, we've got people on the ground doing a baseline survey that will cover 3,600 households across these 4 districts that we're working in. And then we plan to go back and do repeat surveys on these households. And we're fortunate to have Professor Mark Constas here. Mark's a global expert on M&E, and Mark has been providing very valuable time for us to help us design these M&E systems, help us design the surveys, the questionnaires around it, the methods for analysis, etc. But what's also important is when you look at the NGO community in India, or I would suspect the NGO community anywhere in the developing world, their capacity to do M&E work is so limited. Their skills are not there, and they don't have in place the structures and the infrastructure necessary to be able to do the M&E work. So one of the things we're doing is we're actually setting up programs to help build that capacity. Last month we held a training workshop in Delhi where we brought together some of the CEOs or the senior managers of a whole group of NGO civil society organizations in India, essentially training them on why it's important to have an M&E system. And what do you need to do in order to put together that M&E system? What's the resources needed, the infrastructure needed, etc. We're going to follow this up with a lot of other courses on the actual methods, the techniques for M&E, etc. And that's a long-term process of commitment that I think is crucial to make a change, to make a difference, so that development practitioners can finally say, this is what we did, and this is the result, the outcome of the investments that we made. So let me come back to the issue that Ralph brought up in the introduction. Why should Cornell care? Why should Cornell be out there doing this type of work? Now, we know that Cornell has been doing this at least for the last 50 years, if not longer. Even when I was a young student in India, I knew of Cornell's work in agriculture development in India. I knew of Cornell's work in agriculture development in other parts of Asia. So Cornell is seen as a valued partner because of its experience, because of its strong commitment to agriculture development. So going out as a Cornell faculty opens a lot of doors and makes a difference in the development community. I think that's important. I think the second reason why Cornell makes a difference is Cornell has new knowledge, new technology, new science, and new methods of doing things. And bringing this into a development community, a development fora, is really important. It gets us out of the ivy towers or what ivory towers and gets us into the field and to actually show how these techniques work on the ground. It's part of this internationalization of Cornell that I think is such an important aspect of what we do here and how we should disseminate our information out into the real world. But I think the most important reason why I think Cornell should be out there is because I believe that PhD students tackling real world problems is not incompatible with rigorous analytical work that's needed to get a Cornell PhD. In fact, I think a PhD student doing on the ground, action-oriented, analytical research will push that frontier of knowledge even further out. We'll be able to develop new technologies, new methodologies, and new knowledge. And I think as we do that, as Cornell, this is a huge opportunity for us. And I would strongly encourage students here to think about doing on-the-ground research, really research that's relevant to real-world problems, even as they think about a rigorous analytical PhD that's highly publishable. I suspect these PhD theses will be extremely publishable and award-winning theses. With that, thank you so much. If you want to know more about our work, you can visit our website. You'll see the TCI website, which is the new one just launched, and the TARINA website that was launched. Thank you so much.
We're nearly exhausted our time, but it might be possible to take one or two very quick questions. Are any burning questions that we can probably could respond to? Yes, Professor.
Thank you very much. That was really fascinating. Thank you for your presentation. I know Bill Melinda Gates Foundation has been heavily involved in biotechnology, and I'm wondering if there's a role of biotechnology in these projects, or whether you've made a conscious effort to sort of sidestep.
So the issue is that we've not made an effort to sidestep the biotechnology. Our problem is that many of the biotechnology products are not released in the country yet. So, which makes it a real problem to be able to bring them down to an action level. But as they come in, then certainly these projects provide an opportunity to do that. And our work with biofortified sweet potato, the orange flesh sweet potato, provides a model by which one can do that.
Yeah, Randy, go right ahead, and I have one final quick question. Go ahead, Randy.
Okay, yeah. A couple of questions. One is as I listen, I think you could be talking about the fixation on life. And it's a major problem. But one thing that you now have to look at is practice is climate change and how that's going to affect the whole property value. So I guess, and golden rice is not the answer.
Absolutely. So,
Could you repeat the question, please?
so Randy's specific question, well, one point was that this whole rice fixation is common across Asia, not just an India problem, which I totally agree. And the second point was, what's the implications of climate change? We had a postdoc here last year, Asha Sharma, who just left our program. She did a detailed assessment of climate change impacts on agriculture in India by food groups. So she looked at staples and non-staples, etc. And one of her findings, which I think is really important, is that much of the debate around climate change is focused around on impacts on rice and wheat. But the really strong impacts are going to be on the more nutritious crops. They're going to be on pulses, on vegetables, on root crops, etc. Because these crops have been pushed from the more favorable areas to the more drier areas of the country. And the drier areas of the country are going to feel the impacts of climate change sooner. And their ability to manage them will be much more limited. So that's Asha's work on this has been quite incredible.
Yeah. Very quickly, Prabhu, thank you for highlighting this gap that's occurred between the changes in the demand for food in India and the existing production systems. I suspect a gap like this is happening in many countries all over the world. Urbanization, income, globalization, all the regions you've cited. Why is it not, explain to what extent trade for food is filling that gap, and why not more effectively in India?
That's a great question. I think trade is filling some of the gap, but the problem is trade in perishable products is very limited. There's some perishable products, like apples, for example. You see a lot more apples from Washington State in India today than you did when I was growing up. But you don't see other perishable products having the same effect. So what trade has done is it allowed us to substitute into processed food, right? So now processed food has become really cheap because of trade. And then that subsequent health issues that come up from there is a whole new seminar, but that's something that's happening. And we need to look at trade more carefully in terms of how do you get them to be more nutrition sensitive.